I swear you didn't know for September 2020, but you asked what triggered me. I've got 2 girls. So when you have kids, as parents in this room know, your life isn't about yourself anymore, it's about your kids. Everything we do is for our kids. And everything we should be doing is about leaving a proper legacy for our children and hopefully leaving a better world for them. But the world we're leaving for them right now doesn't know what a woman is and is trying to change the sex of children. So I'm not sending my girls into that world, forget about it. And one person can do a lot when they put their mind to something. And I hatched this plan in my head. I didn't know exactly how it was going to play out, but I knew I was embarking on a long culture war and I was going to be on this for decades probably. Because there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. And we need people speaking up, and when you can't even put up a sign that says I love J.K. Rowling, and when people get fired from their jobs for acknowledging biological reality, you've got a big problem. And no one was speaking up about it. It's just little echo chambers on Twitter. So I just got tired of it.
I think that Chris is really hitting on what I think is a profound truth for our day. It's this notion, often we will pull back, often we won't say anything. Often we won't make that sacrifice. We're afraid it could cost us a promotion, it could cost us our job. So we won't make that sacrifice. But the truth is, someone's going to make that sacrifice. And it's probably going to be your kids. So if you think that by being silent, by keeping that job, by being silent and not doing anything, you're just delaying the inevitable. And it's your kids who are going to bear the brunt. Somebody's going to make the sacrifice. If you're a loving parent, it should be you. But I'm on a soapbox, so I'm now back in the interview. You, sir, wrote a book recently.
Yes. So I got a new book called The Third Awakening, which is about, well, the origins of it as a thing. So one of my points is, first of all, that woke isn't just an epithet or a slur that we hurl at people we don't like. It is actually a rigorous, in my view, rigorous social science concept. And the one sentence definition of woke is making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. There it is, one sentence. The definition of woke, sacralization of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. Now, once you hold that these groups are sacred, then anything you say that might offend even the most sensitive member, or might be construed as offending even the most sensitive member of one of these groups is blasphemy, and you must be excommunicated or canceled.
Right.
All of cancel culture flows from the sacralizing principle. That's the central. And so, for example, the emergence of the taboo around race in the mid-60s in the U.S. is what I call the big bang of our moral universe. Once that die was cast, I think everything inevitably flows from that.
That's interesting, and that's helpful. Because often, if you're a candidate, you'll be asked, well, what do you mean by woke? You keep using the word woke, and I think that that's a very helpful definition.
Well, yeah, and I should add, but out of that making sacred come 2 simple principles, which is equity, which is this idea of equal outcomes for men and women, for black and white. So by race, you have to have equal outcomes, even if you obviously need to discriminate against people on the basis of race to engineer those equal outcomes through quotas, i.e. affirmative action. So you've got equity, and then you have this idea of emotional harm protection, preventing emotional trauma. So that means that anything you say that might make somebody feel offended from one of these marginalized groups is a heresy, and therefore you must be canceled, right? So these 2 principles, equity plus emotional harm protection, flow from the idea of making sacred these groups.
That's very helpful. And on the street, do you see this happen? Like, do you see people talking? It feels like you're talking to somebody who's religious. Like when you are out there, you've got your billboard on. Does it feel like you're talking to someone who has been in a cult? Is it like that?
Well, I always call this the cult of gender. Because if you look at all the hallmarks of all cults, this has everything in common with them. What happens when someone's in a cult? They police their own thoughts. They don't allow themselves to examine their doubts. They don't allow themselves to look at alternate evidence. They cut themselves off from their family if need be. And they get very hostile with outsiders. They also get love bombed when they first join the cult. And all of this happens with this. So you've got all these kids who are struggling in society. Kids with autism, kids with other mental health comorbidities, kids who've been sexually abused, kids with trauma, anxiety, depression. They're not love and life, and they're the misfits in school. Now suddenly they come out with this trans identity, and what happens? They're special. They get a lot of love. They're now part of a marginalized group, which apparently is to be celebrated today, because as you mentioned with wokeism, it's this idea that society is systemically oppressive, and we're all oppressed based on our race, sex, sexuality, or financial status, and they need to tear down all these existing power structures. And who's at the top of that oppression period? That oppression pyramid, it's the white man, of course. But he can go from being the most oppressive to being the most oppressed overnight by simply declaring he's a woman, taking away all of women's rights. As we see in the Olympics right now, for example, where you have this woman getting beat up by a man and apologizing for it the next day because of all the pressure put on her.
You know what's happening up here, and I really like it. I've kind of got the theory guy and the practice guy, right? This is wonderful. This is the best job in the world. I'm going back to the theory guy for a second. So the second part of your book is the third grade awakening. But then I've written this down. It's a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism. Thank goodness you've solved the problem. If we could just read that book, we don't even need the People's Party anymore. But can you tell me, Eric, I want you to live up to this idea that you've got a 12-point plan. What of those 12 points would the people in this audience gravitate to the most, or would be most able to do? What are the things that you would tell them to do from your 12 points?
Well, yeah, and I think actually this is where there's a lot for the PPC to do. And part of the book is to say, actually, there's a lot that liberal democratic politics can do to combat the trans indoctrination, but also the race indoctrination, the critical race indoctrination, teaching kids that Canada is a settler, colonial, genocidal country, for example. Tearing down statues, for example. There's a whole lot that governments can do. So one of my arguments is actually a lot of the solutions to woke involve a strong and directed executive government. Ron DeSantis in Florida would be an example of what I'm talking about. Banning critical race theory in schools. You have to get on top of the curriculum. You have to, now I know this is a provincial matter, but still, it's got to be both federal and provincial. So we actually have to say, yes, we do want to teach the truth about history. We want to teach about genocide and slavery and colonialism. But we're not going to teach about British colonialism without talking about Ottoman colonialism or Iroquois or Comanche. We're going to talk about genocide. We're also going to talk about Comanche genocide against the Apache. That way, you don't have 70% of under 25s believing that indigenous people lived before European colonization, lived in quote-unquote peace and harmony, which is an actual belief, right? So we need to actually draw a lot of the emotional power out of these myths around what nasty white people do, because that underpins a lot of the crusade that we see on critical race theory. So that's number one, was we really have to, we got to target education. We've got a ticking time bomb with the younger generation, I'm afraid. We had J.K. Rowling, we had a question, we talked about J.K. Rowling, so we've written, and I had a question that I ran on a survey. Should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publishers? And, if you ask under 25 Brits, they're split 50-50. Whereas anyone over 45 is like maybe 2-3%.
I just want to reiterate that. Under 25, half the people under 25 said that J.K. Rowling, the person who wrote these beautiful books about Harry Potter, should be canceled. Her publisher should stop publishing her books. That's craziness.
And what's going to happen when those people become the median voter, the median employee, the median leader? That's what I worry about. So unfortunately, one of the things I say in the book is the idea that woke is a fad is fading away just because tech firms are cutting back on DEI. It's a pipe dream, actually, because we've got this very woke generation that's going to be moving through corporations, through bureaucracies. And so, no, I think we're just at the beginning, unfortunately. But yeah, just in terms of that 12-point plan, I think government can do a lot. Again, I mean, first of all, they should cut DEI throughout government and civil service.
Sounds like a good policy.
Yeah.
I think I've read it in your book.
Yeah, political neutrality, you're not gonna do pride flags on government building on public property, all right? So that should be, again, part of it. We want political neutrality, we want balance in the curriculum, no indoctrination in schools. All of that has to happen. The precursor for that, though, is the conservative parties, of which the PPC is one. And the PPC is focused on the right things. They need to prioritize culture, and they need to prioritize the culture war. And what they've been doing is throwing it under the bus in favor of things that their donors are more impressed with and that are safer, like talking about low taxes and foreign policy. Conservatism has to change and start becoming more focused on culture, because we don't actually solve this thing. It may be too late. We're going to be an intolerant generation in charge of the culture. All of these older ideas, free speech, equal treatment, due process, all of that is going to go unless we watch it.
Thank you. Okay, so there is a place for the PPC, and the PPC is already filling that gap, and we've seen that with the policies that are out there. Chris, I'm going to throw it to you now, and I'm going to reverse the question a little bit. So Eric's given us some advice on how to combat progressive extremism, but I'm going to turn it around and say to you, in your experience, what can people do? Maybe you've been out with somebody, and they said, can I come along with you, Chris? What can people do that exacerbate the problem? It makes it worse. Like you're thinking, oh, no, don't do that. So what have you seen that makes it worse? For people on the right, you know, they shouldn't have done that. They're on our team, but they're making a mess of it.
Good question.
Don't react to crazy people. Don't yell at crazy people. Don't swear at them. It's your job to be the calm person. If you read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, the guidebook for the left, their real action is your reaction. Now, not all of these people you run into realize what they're even doing. But forget about the arguments at play here. When I'm out on the street and I'm calm, and I've got, like in the last week, this crazy vegan man outside the Vancouver Art Gallery almost hitting me in the head with a piece of wood that he's holding. People don't need to know what our arguments are. They see me being calm, they see him being crazy and yelling, and I've already won. And so when I held a protest in Toronto last year, I said, I don't want you coming with your F Trudeau flags and your upside down Canadian flags, because to the normies out there, the 80% of people in the middle, you look kind of crazy. Plus this was a protest near a school, so you don't want vulgarity.
This is coming from a guy who wears a billboard. And I mean, he realizes that there are things you can do that will be unique, but there are things that you can't do because they do cross the line.
So yeah, you've got freedom of speech and you go do whatever you want. But if you want to be effective, maybe do it a little different. Because your job isn't to reach your friends and to please your friends. Your job is to reach the 80% of people in the middle. And you do that by being professional.
But you also wear a suit when you're out there.
A sport coat, yeah.
Right. And so that is telegraphing to people. I'm not a homeless guy. I'm not predicting the end of the world. I'm actually telling you something that's pretty important.
Yes, and I still feel ridiculous every day I go out. But what surprises me continually to this day, and from day one, is how much respect I give. Because yes, I have nice blazers, it's true. And I have beautiful hair. But I have a message on my sign that says children cannot consent to puberty blockers. And people are afraid to talk about this subject. And they know instinctively, instantly, this is wrong. Forget about everything you've ever read. We don't need scientific studies. We don't need the WPATH files, which my beautiful friend Mia here wrote. Please give her applause, everyone. We really don't need any of this academic work that is being done for the average person, because they're stopping puberty in healthy children. That's all you need to know. And so obviously, when I started and I read this term puberty blockers for the first time in 2019, I said, what are those? I looked it up. Oh, children are being convinced they were born in the wrong body and we're stopping their healthy development. That's all the average person needs to know. That's all anyone needs to know for us to win this battle. Now, of course, in the ensuing 4 years since I've been doing this, a lot of work has been done by the academics, the scientists. We've had the systematic reviews of all the scientific literature. And of course, all of it backs up my position. But the average person on the street, and the people we need to reach in politics, the voters, from the left and the right, they all know that their girls are girls and their boys are boys, and they know instinctively this is wrong. So they have respect for me saying that message. So as crazy as I look, I'm dumbfounded that I do get respect out there, and it's been remarkably effective, because far more effective than all those expensive billboards I put on. Putting on that sign on my front and on my back, a billboard they can't take down, is far more effective than spending thousands of dollars on advertising, because there's a person behind it, I'm not hiding, and that inspires other people and breathes courage into other people.
I'm going to now bring it around a little bit to geography, and you'll see what I mean. You both do work in other countries. You're here in Canada right now. You've done stuff in the US. Eric, a lot of stuff in the UK. I want to do a little bit of a comparison. Do you see differences between how Canadians in general deal with radical cultural issues versus how Americans deal? So Eric, you tell us first, what do you notice? What do you see?
Well, I think Canada is a bit of a ground zero, I'm afraid, certainly for the woke virus, the woke mind virus. And why, there are reasons for this. You know, I think one of the reasons is that Canada, with the decline of the British Empire, there was kind of a vacuum in Canadian identity. Leaving Quebec aside, which had its own secure identity, but to take the English part, they lost their identity with the decline of the British Empire. And what did they fill it with? Left liberalism. 1960s, left liberalism comes up from the United States for the most part and takes over. So we have multiculturalism, we have high immigration. That's the new Canadian identity, and it's perfectly fertile soil. Multiculturalism is a gateway drug to the Great Awakening, in my opinion. When I say multiculturalism, I mean emphasizing difference over commonality. So that is multiculturalism, and that becomes a gateway drug, because actually what multiculturalism implicitly is anti-white.
Yeah.
Here's the fun thing. Wokeness didn't just show up 5-10 years ago. It has built up over decades. And it's accelerated, but its roots go back decades. Yeah.
So when you look at the United States, so what do you see there? What was the inoculant against this incredible tsunami of wokeness? They seem to be able to combat it a bit better.
Well, the difference there is, first of all, their national identity there is a tradition there, which is this traditional American national identity, and so it's got the two parties. So Republicans have a different American national identity, which incorporates the founders, the settling of the West, etc. And that gives them a foundation from which they can then attack this stuff. And there are red states. The media, the print media is very progressive, but the electronic media now has some diversity with Fox News. And that doesn't really exist in Canada. Whereas in Britain, the electronic media is pretty homogeneously left-wing, except for GB News, which is an upstart. It's doing a great job, but it's an upstart. The print media, however, is much more balanced. So you have more conservative papers there. So it's easier to get a message out and to have another side to the debate. Whereas in Canada, there's only one media, basically. I mean, National Post is doing a better job, but it's still pretty small. True North is pretty small. And so you more or less have an echo chamber. And the political class, they all voted for that genocide resolution around the residential schools. So there's no real variation there. And so you've just got more of a monoculture. It's very hard to break out of that matrix in Canada, and whereas in the US and Britain, there's more of a debate.
Gotcha. And now, Chris, for you, on the ground, are you noticing a difference between Americans and Canadians?
There's a huge difference. I talk about this all the time. So they have obviously a much larger population base. One of the challenges in Canada is we are 40 million people, but we're a huge country. We're all spread out. There are just a handful of people in British Columbia where I'm from fighting this culture war. There are more people in Ontario, obviously, but having a larger population in the States helps. I think the biggest factor is that country was born out of rebellion. 248 years ago, they rejected the king, and that patriotism, that fight, gets passed down from generation to generation. As I grew up, a Canadian here, we always used to make fun of patriotism of Americans. That's the thing that Canadians do. You drive down across the border and they have American flags on all their houses, right? But it's beautiful. I think it's great. And there's just a different fight down there. We've never had to fight for anything. Of course, we fought in the 2 world wars for our allies, but we've never really had to fight for much in Canada, really until COVID, until our freedoms were taken away. And so the trucker protest was amazing. I'm sure many people in this room were at it.
Yep.
And when I would be standing out on the street in Vancouver or wherever, I was banned from walking on certain streets in Vancouver because I got arrested after Antifa assaulted me, because this is what happens in communist countries. But all these freedom people would come walking by me, and I knew when all this COVID madness was over, a lot of them were going to start fighting this gender fight, and that has worked out. But as soon as I went down into the US when the borders opened up, right away I had so much support, instantly. There are hundreds of organizations fighting the culture battle down there. There are also thousands of leftist organizations fighting this. But there's just a different spirit down there, and we need to adopt some of that. We need to start a conservative grassroots effort in Canada, where we're training people to run for school boards, where we're training people to get involved in local politics. Because we can't expect a leader, we can't expect Pierre Poilievre, who governs based off of polling. We can't expect him to lead on any of these issues. Change happens from us. If you want to cause change, you need to lead the change.
I've seen what you have, and I maybe have 1 minute left, so I'll conclude. Give us something that is hopeful. Something that is hopeful. You see something, and make it in Canada, it's Canadian context, something that brings you hope relative to the culture. Eric, you get yours.
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, I was going to say, you know, I mentioned about the young people being very woke and that ticking time bomb when they become adults. But one of the things we see just in the last 18 months amongst young people, in some of the survey data I've looked at, is they have started to shift in a conservative direction. The under 25s on a few issues like immigration and unisex versus single-sex bathrooms. So this is one of the trans issues. If that continues, and that's a big if, and this is still early days, we could be at an inflection point. And the other thing I would say about Canada is, compared to Britain, actually Canadian young people they seem to be more conservative and a bit less woke, oddly, which I wouldn't have never have expected. Whereas older Canadians are actually a lot more left-wing than older Brits or Americans. Actually, younger Canadians are more conservative than younger British people. And so I don't know if something's happening maybe amongst young people in Canada. That would be perhaps one of the more optimistic things.
Thank you, thank you. And we're going to give the last word to Chris, something that gives you hope about Canada.
This room gives me hope. So, on my issue, gender ideology, I think we're absolutely destroying the left on this issue, the far left. We're making progress all over the world. Several countries have put a stop to this. England has banned this, and they just elected a Labour government, a leftist government, and Wes Streeting, their new Minister of Health, made the ban on puberty blockers permanent. Yeah! So a leftist in Scotland, same thing, they banned puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. This report that was written by Dr. Hilary Cass, a lifetime pediatrician in the UK, she spent 4 years reviewing everything. And she published this 388-page report, which along with the WPATH files, cannot be ignored. And several countries are putting a stop to this. We have 25 states in the US who have legislated an end to this. Whereas just 2 years ago, I was meeting with members of Congress, and they didn't want to touch this issue, just 2 years ago, because it was too toxic. The sorting issue, they were fine with, because Leah Thomas was lapping women in the pool, and they get it. This whole business of child transition required more of an education, because when people don't understand something, they don't talk about it. So what we've been doing is educating people, and now that they know how to talk about it, they will talk about it, because anyone in the world can say you're a bigot, but what they're doing is sterilizing children and cutting off their body parts, and parents all around the world aren't going to let it stand. And we're not going to stand. Even here in Canada now, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is going to ban puberty blockers for kids under 16. That's a start. It's not nearly far enough, but you have to start somewhere. In New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, they want to get gender ideology out of schools. And even from the Conservative Party, 5 years later than the PPC, Maxime Bernier is the only politician who's been leading on this issue. They're even showing signs of bravery, the tiniest signs. They're actually willing to speak about this a tiny bit. Because it's up to us to change the culture. It's up to us to move that Overton window. And one thing that the PPC is going to need to do moving forward is you're going to be responsible for being the actual opposition to this Conservative Party, to hold them accountable to conservative values. They might end up taking some of the credit for the change that's being done, but we all know where it's actually coming from. It's coming from grassroots Canadians, and it's coming from the people in this room. So we're going to get it done.
Well, there's no nothing that I can add to that, except to say that we've heard some wise words here tonight. If I had to pull out some of the things that resonated with me, we want to be the respectful people, we want to be the civil people, we want to be the informed people, but we also want to be the brave people. So take that with you, and thank you very much.
Hey, how you
And of course, we
doing?
heard from two of these esteemed gentlemen earlier today, but if you want to hear more from Billboard Chris, he's going to be live tomorrow at 11 a.m. So make sure you're in the main room, 11 a.m. tomorrow, revision conference, and we're going to talk more about these cultural issues. Thanks again for all of your support. We do have the hospitality suites opening at 10 o'clock over the Best Western, so please feel free to mingle, grab yourself a coffee. If there's any dessert left, help yourself, and we'll see you at 10 o'clock at the suite. If not, we'll see you tomorrow morning in revision. Thanks again.
Can you say good night? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it just was.
Oh yeah, I saw that on Twitter. Yeah.
You're actually the final minutes there. But it was great. That's what I said about the Conservative Party today.
Yeah, it's nice.
I'm not here to praise them. Yeah. Great.
I love your improv.
Absolutely.
Can we say good night to?
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow.